Please open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 7. Unfortunately, the person who was down to give a little reflection is unwell today, but I'm sure there have been lots of reflections amongst this group, so maybe over lunch it'll be a good time to share how the Lord has been speaking to you through this week and last week's passage. We're going to be starting at verse 25, 1 Corinthians 7, starting at verse 25. Now, about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it's good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn, as if they did not. Those who are happy, as if they were not. Those who buy something, as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world, as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone's worried that he might not be acting honourably towards the virgin he's engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning, they should get married. But the man who's settled the matter in his own mind, who's under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God.
I want you to picture this scene with me. It's the year 2000. I'm a uni student. I'm at the residential college where I live with my girlfriend of 3 months. We both have an open Bible in our hands. She is crying and I have a terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. Why? Well, we've been reading through 1 Corinthians together, and on this day we've come to chapter 7, and we've just read Paul say that it's good to stay unmarried, and that's thrown into question the trajectory that we thought we were on, which is a trajectory towards marriage. My girlfriend has just said these words, perhaps we should break up. And now we're both sitting there in silence, and those words are hanging in the air. Should I marry? That was our agonising question that day. Should I marry? It's a question which we will all ask or have asked or are asking. Sometimes we ask it in the concrete, should I marry at all? In the abstract. Sometimes we ask it in the abstract, should I marry at all? Sometimes it's in the concrete, should I marry this particular person? And as we ask it, there can be strong emotions at play, can't there? As my story illustrates. As we ask it, it can feel like there's a lot at stake. If I don't marry, will I be lonely? Will I live my life without intimacy? If I do marry, what if it's the wrong person? What if I'm unhappy and I can't get out? It feels like there's a lot at stake. It feels like it's a very important question, perhaps the most important question of our life. Recently, Anna and our 2 older kids were all homesick, and they spent the day watching a romantic comedy together. Now, romantic comedies have a very well-established narrative arc. Narrative arc means the shape of the story, the shape of the plot. And you know what it is, right? Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy and girl get together. So if you're watching a romantic comedy, you know exactly what is going to happen. Well, not our kids. This was their very first romantic comedy. And when I got home that day and Anna described her day on her sickbed watching this movie, I could tell that what had been fun for her was not watching the movie, which she said was pretty lame, but watching our kids react with surprise to these utterly predictable, formulaic, obvious plot developments. But why are they so predictable to us? Because we've seen it so many times before, right? We've grown up with it. We've been drip-fed that narrative arc throughout our lives. And when you think about it, this is a narrative arc which says boy without girl or girl without boy is the biggest problem in life. It's a narrative arc that says boy and girl getting together, that's the solution, that's the happy ending, that's what life is all about. And if that's what we've grown up with, it's no surprise that when we ask this question, this should I marry question, it's going to feel like a very weighty, a very important one, perhaps the most important one we'll ever ask. So if that's the case, if this is a question where strong emotions are at play, where we feel like there's a lot at stake, we feel like this is perhaps the most important question we'll ever ask, if all of that is the case, then as followers of Jesus, we really want to make sure that we're making this decision in a cross-shaped, Bible-directed, gospel-oriented way. And 1 Corinthians 7 equips us to do just that. Since the beginning of chapter 7, Paul has been responding to the Corinthians' questions about relationships. At the start of the chapter, as we saw a few weeks ago, he wrote about sex and singleness and marriage. And then, as we saw last week, he outlined that important principle that we can remain as we are because the gospel is sufficient. Well, now in today's text, he gives a more extended instruction to people who are single, to virgins, that is people who've never married, and then also at the very end of the section to widows. And the question he's addressing throughout this extended section is that very same question that my girlfriend and I were addressing that day, the question that we will all ask at some point. Should I marry? We need to hear what he has to say in this text. And before we begin our time in this text, a word to those of us who are already married. This is not the moment for you to mentally switch off and write your final assignment. This text is God's word for all of us. You never know if or when you may find yourself single again, but even right now, you are part of Christian communities where you have the opportunity and privilege to minister to and to disciple people who are single. And even more broadly, even beyond that, as you'll see, as we observe how Paul answers this should I marry question, we're going to see something profound about all of our decisions in life, about how we can make cross-shaped decisions in all of life. So let's dive in. I'm going to read now from verse 25. Please follow along with me. And as I do, I want you to notice the way Paul goes about answering this should I marry question, the approach he takes to the question. Verse 25. Now, about virgins, that is, people who've never been married, I have no command from the Lord. That means he's got no direct quotes from Jesus. But I give a judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. And here is his judgment, verse 26. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Let's just notice the way that Paul goes about giving advice about whether to marry. Throughout this text, he's not on the whole speaking in absolutes. He doesn't often use words like right and wrong, must and must not when he's talking about this question of whether to marry. More often he's using words like good. Verse 26, it is good for a man to remain as he is. That's the principle that we saw last week, now being applied to single people. It is good. But that doesn't mean it's wrong for someone to change their status and get married. Verse 28, if you do marry, you have not sinned. This is the framework for this decision here, one of freedom. God gives freedom to choose. Both marrying and not marrying are valid options for the Christian. Paul is saying that neither is inherently sinful. There are some hard, absolute boundaries. For example, in verse 39, he's going to say to the widow who remarries that the new husband has to be one who belongs to the Lord. So there are some hard boundaries, but within those, there is much freedom. So just think about what Paul is and particularly what he isn't doing in this section. See, he isn't telling them exactly what to do. He's God's messenger, he's God's apostle, but he doesn't say you must marry or you must not marry. He doesn't make the decision for them. And neither does he suggest that God will make the decision for them. He doesn't say, look, if you want to know if you should marry or who you should marry, here's how to find a personalized sign from God telling you what to do. He doesn't say that. Christians sometimes spend a lot of time looking for those kinds of signs, but that's not the way Paul directs us how to answer this question. Paul isn't telling them what to do or how to find out from God what God is telling them what to do. Instead, what Paul is doing is he's equipping them to use the freedom God has given them to make a wise and godly decision. And they need that because just as there's freedom to choose, it doesn't mean that all choices are as good as each other. And what we're going to see in this passage is that what is a wise and godly choice will depend on the circumstances. And in this text, Paul equips us to make decisions according to our circumstances. And he does that by saying, in deciding whether to marry, here's what you should consider. So what is that? What are the things that we should consider? I'm going to highlight 3 things that come out of this text. The first one is the priority of gospel ministry. Priority of gospel ministry is something we need to consider as we decide whether to marry. Look again there at verse 26. Why does Paul say that it's good for a man to remain as he is? It's because of the present crisis. What does he mean? Verse 29, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. And then verse 31, for this world in its present form is passing away. The present crisis is that the time is short. The present crisis is that the world in its present form is passing away. See, the coming of Christ has triggered a crisis because Christ has now come and will come again to judge. Time is now short. The time between these 2 points is short, it's limited, it's running out. The time for Christians to tell the gospel, the time for the world to enter into the kingdom, that time is short. And what this means is that your priorities must change. My priorities must change. Our priorities must change. It means that normal life priorities can no longer be our priorities. If getting married and starting a family used to be our number 1 priority, well, this present crisis, it has to change that. Whatever we used to live for, all of that needs to be radically reconsidered now. What needs to shape all of our decisions now, including whether to marry, is the priority of gospel ministry in this present crisis. And that will radically change the way we approach marriage. Verse 29, have a look at that. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Now, Paul can't be saying here that a husband should neglect his wife. In Ephesians 5, he talks about a husband's God-given duty to give himself for his wife's well-being. And even earlier on in chapter 7, he's already said that husbands and wives should nurture healthy marriages, including through regular sexual intimacy. He can't be saying neglect, but what he is saying is that married people should no longer live as if their marriage is the most important thing in their life, as if it is the highest priority. Read on. Those who mourn, verse 30, as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Again, he's not saying that we will never mourn or that we will never be happy, but this present crisis, this certainty that Christ will return soon, it changes the way we do those things. Our mourning is not our central focus. Our happiness is not the be-all and end-all of life. Keep reading. Those who buy something, verse 30, as if it were not theirs to keep. Verse 31, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. If we're buying something, if we're buying a new house or we're using something like a brand new phone, we can no longer act as if those decisions, as if those possessions are the most important things in our lives, as if our well-being depends on having them and keeping them, because we have a new focus, we have a new priority, one that makes sense of the times in which we live. Every now and then I have a dream that I'm back at high school. I've got my school uniform on, I'm back in maths class. Do you ever have that dream? Is it just me? Whenever I have that dream, in the dream I have this nagging feeling that something is wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And then I wake up and I realise what it is. It's that I'm 46 years old. And I finished school almost 30 years ago. And it makes absolutely no sense for me to be in my school uniform as a student back at school. It's a massive era mistake. And in the same way for us Christians now, it makes absolutely no sense for us to pursue normal life priorities. It's a massive era mistake. It's like a 46-year-old putting on his school uniform and turning up to maths. Because now is the present crisis. Time is short. The earth in its present form is passing away. And what needs to shape our decisions, what needs to shape our lives, is the priority of gospel ministry. So what does all that mean for the should I marry question? Well, it means that we're going to answer that question very differently to the people of the world and the way they answer it. See, for us, getting married can never be the priority. For us, whether or not getting married will be good will depend on how it impacts our walk with Christ, our service of Christ, how it impacts our ability to prioritise gospel ministry while time is short. Back in the year 2000, when my girlfriend and I read 1 Corinthians 7 that day, we didn't break up that day. But 1 Corinthians 7 got us asking a question. Would we be better able to pursue Christ, engage in his mission together or apart? And we didn't know what the answer to that question would be, but we agreed that we would pursue the answer to that question. And if the answer was better apart, that we should break up. And what we discovered in the months that followed, that as we asked that question, there were all sorts of ways in which, as we'd been thinking about our future, we weren't keeping the present crisis in mind. What we discovered were all of these idols, things that we were pursuing, which are only going to fade away soon, including the way we were thinking about marriage. So 1 Corinthians 7 sparked this journey for us. It was 10 months of painful work, slowly prizing those idols out of our grasp. And by the end of that, we were of one mind about the priority of gospel ministry in this age. And we believed that we could do that better together. And so Anna and I got engaged. I like the way the author Al Su summarises the principle which is at play here. He writes, our ultimate concern must be to place ourselves where we can actively minister and help accomplish God's work and purposes on earth. And as inviting and appealing as marriage might be, Some things in life are more important than being married. Marriage is good, we've seen that. It's a valid option for Christians, but it mustn't be the priority. And in this present crisis, there are things that are more important than marriage. So that's the first thing we consider when we're making the decision about whether to marry, the priority of gospel ministry. Let's have a look at the second now. The second thing is the value of an undivided focus. The value of an undivided focus. Follow with me from verse 32. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So Paul is speaking practically now. He's not trying to set up a two-tiered spiritual hierarchy. Remember, that's something the Corinthians had been trying to do when they said, it's good to not have sex. You'll be more spiritual if that's the case. And Paul had said, no, the gospel is completely sufficient for our spiritual well-being. So he's not setting up this two-tier, but he's speaking practically about how we use the freedom we have in the gospel. And he's pointing out a practical reality in this section that if you get married, your interests, your attention, your focus is divided. And rightly so if you're married. This is the right way for married people to live, with their focus divided between honouring and loving and caring for their spouse and attending to the Lord's affairs, which I take here to mean other ministry, that is outside the family ministry. It's divided. So as people who want to prioritise gospel ministry in this present crisis, point one, here's a practical factor we need to consider as we consider marriage. Singleness does have this practical advantage in that it allows for an undivided devotion to the Lord, an undivided focus, which marriage does not. Pastor Richard Foster puts it this way. He says, no one should enter the covenant of marriage without understanding the immense amount of time and energy involved in making that relationship work. We need to face the fact that we cannot do many of the kinds of things which Paul did and be married. When we lived in Southeast Asia, we were training local missionary candidates for mission within their own country. One of those missionary candidates was a man which I'll call Agus. When he graduated, he went and he established a cafe in a gospel-poor part of the country. It was this place where people could come and drink coffee and explore scripture, and it proved to be a very fruitful ministry with people coming to Christ. And when I reflect on the way he did that and the amount of focus it required and the flexibility of lifestyle it required to set up and run for Agus, I doubt that he might have done that or could have done that if he had a wife and family. I think of another single lady from that missionary training school called Lena, who when she graduated, she went to a very remote, unreached part of the country which was very undeveloped, where there were no schools and things like that. And I think that if she had a husband and children, I doubt that ministry would have been possible for her. Back here in Australia, I've known people who are single who've taken advantage of their relative freedom and undivided focus to do things like drop everything and help someone in the midst of a crisis, or to do things like an itinerant ministry that might be unwise for a person with a spouse and children. See, a practical advantage of singleness in this present crisis time is that it allows an undivided focus, a missional flexibility which marriage does not. It won't necessarily mean more volume of time for those activities. Different people have different capacities, married and single. But it is, I think Paul is saying, a flexibility or an undivided focus. And that, he says, makes singleness a very good choice. So, when deciding whether to marry, what should we consider? So far, we've seen the first two things. The first one, the priority of gospel ministry. The second one, the value of an undivided focus. And now the third one, the importance of personal holiness. The importance of personal holiness. Now, after that second point about the undivided focus, we might think that singleness would always be the better choice to make. But no, that's not the case. What's better is circumstance dependent. And Paul is about to describe one circumstance where the better choice is to get married. Have a look at verse 36. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honourably towards the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. So Paul's speaking about engaged or betrothed couples here. And he says if that couple finds that their sexual passions are running strong, leading towards inappropriate sexual behaviour outside of marriage, to that couple, and in that set of circumstances, Paul says the better choice would be to marry. They should, he says, they should get married. Personal holiness is important. It's a factor which needs to be considered. Verse 37, but the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So in a different set of circumstances to the man who has control over his will, which probably means over his sexual desires, to that man, in those circumstances, the choice not to marry is a good one. In fact, it's an even better one. Verse 38. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. Just notice once again the framework for the way Paul is equipping us to make this decision. There is real freedom here, isn't there? Freedom to choose between two right and good options. But there are factors as well, factors that make some choices even better than others. And one of those factors that we're seeing in these verses that we need to consider is personal holiness. Personal holiness matters. So there we have it, 3 things to consider when we stand in this time of Christ's imminent return and ask that question, should I marry? Priority of gospel ministry, the value of an undivided focus, and the importance of personal holiness. One question we might ask is, are these the only things we should consider? And I would say no, Paul is not presenting an exhaustive list of all that we should consider. There will be others that we learn from other parts of Scripture. And in some cases, those other factors may even be crucial ones. For example, the Christian who is same-sex attracted and who is striving to obey the Bible's clear teaching that marriage is only for a man and a woman, for that person, God's teaching elsewhere on what marriage is will be a crucial factor in making the decision not to marry. So 1 Corinthians 7 doesn't contain an exhaustive list, but it does show us how to make this decision. So how does this all work out in practice? In particular, when do we make this decision? Do we make it in the abstract, or do we make it when a particular potential marriage partner comes along? I've known people who've made a decision to commit to singleness all their life who are now married. I've known people who've decided that they want to marry who are still single. It's complex, isn't it? John Stott was a pastor and an author, and he was a single man for all of his 90 years. He was once asked in an interview whether someone can know at an early age that they're called to singleness or whether this is something that you just fall into. And this is what he said. He said, I personally believe more in the second alternative that you've given, that is, that people discover it gradually and as the years pass, begin to think that God is probably not calling them to marry. And on a similar topic, he said in another interview some years later, he said, In spite of rumours to the contrary, I have never taken a solemn vow or heroic decision to remain single. On the contrary, during my 20s and 30s, like most people, I was expecting to marry one day. In fact, during this period, I twice began to develop a relationship with a lady who I thought might be God's choice of life partner for me. But when the time came to make a decision, I can best explain it by saying that I lacked an assurance from God that he meant me to go forward. So I drew back. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, I think I know why. I could never have travelled or written as extensively as I have done if I'd had the responsibilities of a wife and family. Now, I think there might be real wisdom in that approach. Given what we've seen, which is it depends heavily on the circumstances, perhaps instead of trying to answer the should I marry question once and for all for our whole life, perhaps it's a question best answered if and when a potential for marriage arises. But when we do ask that question and seek an answer and make that decision, 1 Corinthians 7 trains us to make it in a way which is completely different to the way the people of the world will answer that question. It helps us to see that we have a completely different narrative arc shaping our life trajectory. See, if we're taking our cues from romantic comedies, then our narrative arc is all about finding the one. The climax, the happy ending comes when boy and girl get together. But that is not the narrative arc for us. Whether you're married, whether you're single, as a follower of Christ, that is not our narrative arc. Our narrative arc is so much better. It centres around Christ. It's shaped by the fact that Christ, his return is impending. It's shaped by the reality that time is short, that the world in its present form is passing away. This narrative arc focuses our hearts and our minds on Christ, on serving Christ. The problem in this narrative arc that needs resolution is not boy without girl, it's not girl without boy, it's world without Christ. Everything else in our narrative, including marriage, is a subplot that needs to be put into service of that main plot. This is the narrative arc for us. Don't let a lesser one take over your life. If you're married, that will mean that you don't let marriage become your life's primary goal and focus and priority. If you're single, it may mean that you choose to stay that way for the sake of the kingdom. And I want to finish today with a story of someone who did just that. Back in 1873, at the age of 33, a lady called Lottie Moon moved to China as a single missionary to do pioneering evangelistic work there. In those early years, she faced a lot of opposition and rejection and persecution, but she persevered and she had the joy of seeing Chinese women who heard the gospel come to faith. After she'd been on the field for about 8 years, she began a relationship with a man named Crawford Toy, and he asked her to marry him. But because of the circumstances, marrying him would have meant leaving China, and so she refused him. Years later, a young relative asked Lottie if she'd ever been in love, and this was her answer. Yes, but God had first claim on my life, and since the two conflicted, there could be no question about the result. Lottie remained in China, evangelising the unreached for an additional 31 years after that point. And after her death in 1915, the Tengchao Church set up a monument which is there to this day in the Tengchao region of China, and on that monument is inscribed this description of Lottie. After she graduated from school, she never married. She dedicated her whole spirit, body, and life to the service of God. What a beautiful, Christ-focused, cross-shaped narrative arc that is.